and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about Margaret of Denmark.
One day we will be remembered.
Margaret of Denmark was born on the 23rd of June, 1456. She had two older brothers that died young before she was born. At the time of her birth, she had one surviving older brother named John, and she stayed the youngest until she was 15 years old, and then was joined by another brother, baby Frederick. Her father was King Christian I, King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, an overachiever, and her mother was Dorothea, Queen of the same. When Margaret was about 4, there was some talk about how much money Scotland owed King Christian. It was a lot, and the Scots were having trouble paying it back, and King Christian was having trouble coming up with dowry for his daughter, in part because of how much Scotland owed him. But the 9-year-old King of Scots, King James III, needed a wife, so a deal was struck. Margaret would marry the young king, and for her dowry, King Christian would forgive the Scottish debt. But they weren't married just yet. They were, after all, just 4 and 9. In 1468, they were officially betrothed because Margaret was 12 and time was a-tickin'. They got married a year later at 13 and 18 respectively. Young for marriage, especially Margaret, even at that time. That's almost bare minimum to be married at that time. And Margaret was leaving Denmark at the age of 13 to be queen of a foreign country. A foreign country with a recent history of kings becoming kings as children because of the untimely deaths of their fathers. So, fun. The new little Queen Margaret was given the largest jointure allowed by Scottish law. 1/3 of the royal revenues went to her. That's a lot, guys. Queen Margaret loved clothes and jewelry and was known for dressing in all the latest styles. She was an early influencer. Everyone wanted to be like little Queen Margaret. 2 years after Margaret's marriage, her mother, Queen Dorothea, had her last baby, little Frederick, after a 15-year gap in children. That sounds like a lot. Margaret became pregnant for the first time just 2 years after that. And on the 17th of March, 1473, Prince James was born, when Queen Margaret was 17. Queen Margaret had a reputation for being beautiful, gentle, and sensible. Following the birth of her first baby, James, Queen Margaret went on a pilgrimage to Whitethorn Priory, probably to thank God for the healthy birth of a prince. While Margaret loved her son, her marriage was not a happy one. Maybe that's what naturally happens when you marry a 13-year-old off to a king to solve two countries' money problems. This wasn't a fairy tale. The year after Margaret's first baby was born, her husband was talking with the English. King James III and King Edward IV were going to agree on a treaty that should last 45 years of peace. In addition to the peace part of the agreement, there was a part that said that baby Prince James of Scotland was to be betrothed to 4-year-old Princess Cecily of England. Not yet, of course, because they were 1 and 4, but the plan was for them to marry at about 15 and 18 respectively. If you're listening to this episode, along with season 1, Elizabeth Woodville's episode, her daughter Cecily was just betrothed to the baby heir to the Scottish throne. King Edward of England started making payments on the agreed upon dowry. This was a deal. So much so that King Edward was making payments to Scotland. While Queen Margaret's marriage wasn't a happy one, Queen Margaret understood the assignment and did have sex with her husband, but really only for procreation. It wasn't an enjoyable pastime. And as soon as she knew she was pregnant, she's like, I'm out. See you in a year. Thanks. 3 years after the birth of her first son, Prince James, they had a second son, Prince James. No, that isn't a mistake. They were both named Prince James Stuart. Same name. I'm not even sure why. Other than one of them was going to be a king, and sometimes those kids died and you needed the spare, and they were going hard, I think, for a King James IV. And even if their heir died, their spare could still be King James IV. While Margaret respected her husband's position as king, he wasn't the husband she wanted. One of the marital issues was that her husband seemed to favor their second son, James, over their oldest son, James. James was his favorite. They're both James. But, I don't know, he didn't vibe with his oldest son. He was like, the second kid, that's the move. That's who should be king after me. And Margaret didn't appreciate that. Right on schedule, though, the queen had her third baby, named Prince John. Why not James this time? I don't know. Maybe they're like, 2 James is enough. 3 would be too much. So, third baby John. In 1479, Queen Margaret was the 24-year-old mother of 3, and her husband and his brothers were in a dispute. The king had his younger brother arrested on charges of treason. Word on the street was treason involving witchcraft. And Margaret's imprisoned brother-in-law died under mysterious circumstances. On the order of his brother the king? Maybe. Allegedly. And coincidentally or not, this was just 1 year after the King of England's brother George had been executed on those very same charges, treason via witchcraft. It's going around, I guess, witches hooking up with king's younger brothers. The Scottish king's other brother, Alexander, had his land seized, and he was not going to just stick around and let himself mysteriously die in prison, so he fled to France, screaming for help. The King of France declined to help it. He was welcome to stay in France. Like, yeah, hang out, bro. We can be pals. But I'm not giving you an army. A few years later, that 45-year-old peace treaty was breaking down, about 4 decades early. So the king's brother took his chances with England. Maybe they had a helpful army. King Edward was open to this deal. Northern England had been suffering raids at the hands of the southern Scottish lords, and he was over it. And he was like, if you can't keep the Scots in Scotland, then maybe I need to take control of Scotland. He was over it, and his daughter was not going to marry the Scottish prince. King Edward would help Prince Alexander depose his brother in exchange for giving over southern Scotland to the English. So he was like, yeah, I'll help you get your brother's country, but there will be a commission. I'm gonna get paid. So King Edward sent his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, along with Margaret's brother-in-law, Alexander, and a 20,000-man army to invade Scotland. Margaret's husband, King James, marched out with his army to meet them. But he was arrested before he got there because Prince Alexander had conspired with some bitter nobles, allegedly, and he was apprehended by his own army before the English army even got there. When England arrived with their army, they put Edinburgh Castle, where the king was imprisoned by his own men, under siege, because the gates didn't open for them. They were like, I thought we had a deal. Why? Okay, well, we'll just starve you out then. So if they were working together, by this point, their negotiations had broken down, and somebody had changed their mind because they were not on the same page, allegedly. The king's father had some still living younger half-brothers from his mother's second marriage to James Stuart the Reboot, and they got with the disgruntled nobles, and they were like, hey, you want the king gone? Girl, same. But why do we have to get the English involved? We don't want to pay that commission, especially when they don't even have to fight for us. All we have to do is agree with each other, and we have all the power. So the king's uncles had control inside of the castle, where the king was imprisoned, and the king's brother and the English had control outside of the castle, the same castle. And King James was just chilling in captivity, somewhat clueless to what was happening to his government, allegedly. Queen Margaret was not so worried about her husband's difficulties. She's like, oh, he's in jail? Okay, fine. Not my problem. What was her problem was the fate of her children, James Squared and John, if their father lost power officially. The king was a big boy, and he could handle it. So Richard had Edinburgh Castle under siege, but this was getting more expensive than he expected. The prince had been working with the nobles and had told the English this was going to be fast and easy. It was looking like it was going to be a lot harder. You have to provision for 20,000 men, and they didn't have enough to go for any length of time because they thought they had a deal. And England was like, too long, didn't read, we're going home. The king's brother, after losing his English army, got with his half-uncles and was like, look, we all want the king gone. How about let's make a deal? And not just because my army left me. I want to work with you. And they were like, yeah, we'll take a king that'll be on our side over the king we arrested. Deal. Let's do that. And Margaret's brother-in-law was in charge, but her husband was still king, even if it was in name only. He was in prison, and his brother was basically his regent. They didn't kill him mysteriously or starve him to death, so that must have been a pleasant surprise because it was going around. But he sensed weakness. If they weren't killing him, maybe he still had a chance. And he did. He got a few more of the influential nobles back on his side, specifically the head bitch in charge of Edinburgh Castle. And the queen was helping. She worked for reinstatement of the monarch. Again, not for her husband, who she was fine without, but for her boys. They were safer if their father was the king, in more than just name. So Parliament started passing contradictory laws because they were no longer under the control of Prince Alexander. They were back under the control of the Queen and her still jailed husband. Prince Alexander saw the writing on the wall and fled. He was out of there. He came back and tried to redepose the king, but by then the king had been released and was back in charge, and he was like, oh, that's cute, but you're not going to do that. After this whole mess was sorted out, the Queen and king lived separately. This was not a reconciliation. She's like, look, I still don't like you. I want nothing to do with you, but try and hold it together. Stay king so that my kid can be king after you. King James lived in Edinburgh Castle, and Queen Margaret lived at Stirling Castle with her children. Because like they told me in high school health class, the only safe sex is no sex at all. And Queen Margaret was not interested in providing her husband with other children after the trauma that he had caused to her first 3 children. And she didn't like him very much. But who can blame her? I also wouldn't be thinking this is a great time for a new baby. Because things were still pretty bad. Prince Alexander got more English support. And then King James had entered into a humiliating indenture. But then King Edward of England died unexpectedly. For more information on that, check out Elizabeth Woodville's episode, because that is where we are in England. Elizabeth Woodville's husband had just died, and England was about to enter its Richard III era. So Prince Alexander lost his main ally and fled to Scotland, handing over his castle to the English army on his way out. He was like, look, I have this castle, but I don't need it anymore. Here you go, English. Mess with my brother. It's fine. I'm out of here. Prince Alexander came back a few more times, and each time with a little less support, so eventually he just retired to France. Good try, buddy. Just a few years after the whole husband deposed thing, the Queen died at Stirling Castle after falling ill. One of her sons claimed she had been poisoned, but we don't know for sure, and her sons were still children at the time of her death, so we just don't know. After Margaret's death, her husband's treatment of her oldest son worsened. He had never liked him, and now he liked him less. And he had always been closer to his mother, and he didn't trust his father, and his dad was really working hard to make his second son his heir. 2 years after Margaret's death, Prince James essentially ran away from home, leaving Stirling Castle without his father's permission. Word on the street was that King James was on his way to Stirling to arrest his heir. Because remember that whole second son is better thing. But King James had never been overwhelmingly popular, so Prince James found allies in the rebel lords. Prince James and the rebel lords met outside Stirling Castle, and a battle ensued. Prince James is trying to be like Prince Edward. Remember when Prince Edward deposed his father, Edward II, becoming King Edward III? Well, Prince James is trying to depose King James III because he wants to be King James IV. James reportedly gave orders, though, that his father not be harmed. But the 15-year-old prince was not listened to. King James was killed outside of Stirling during the battle. The king is dead. Long live the king. And with that, Prince James became King James IV, the new king at the age of 15. So far, the oldest James Stuart to become king, because at least he's 15, but it really is kind of the Stuart curse. Very young kings, although in this case, he did wage war against his father. And he suffered from tremendous guilt for the rest of his life, for the indirect part he played in his father's death. For the rest of his life, he wore an iron belt right against his skin to remind him of his sins, and he added weight to it every year. And that is where I'll leave it for now. What did you think of Margaret of Denmark? It's sad. She was married off to solve a debt issue. And she clearly wasn't happy with the way it turned out. It seems like it was hard for her, but she stood her ground and she was like, look, I'm a queen. I'll have some babies, but then don't touch me. Stay away. And I can respect that. For another book club suggestion, one of the books I read in preparation for this season's podcast is Scottish Queens, 1034 to 1714. It's a book by Rosalind Marshall, and it's very good. It's very informative. And it helped me a lot with names and dates and places and such. I recommend it. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
You'll be remembered.
Thanks for listening.